Welcome back to our final segment on culture. This is part 4. And in this section or segment, we are just going to further analyze culture and discuss some more terminology. So some of the terms we are going to discuss in this segment are universality, generality, and particularity. Universal. A universal exists in every culture. And these universalities and generalities are things that anthropologists are kind of always trying to find. One question anthropologists often ask when comparing across cultures is, does every culture have a type of marriage? And we'll look into that in the middle of semester about Module 8 or thereabouts. We'll start looking at marriages and families. Does every culture have a funerary type ceremony? Does every culture include kind of a supernatural element when they are dealing with someone's death? That's another question an anthropologist might ask. So when anthropologists ask these questions, what they're trying to find out is what makes us human. Do we all have marriage? Do we all grieve death in the same ways, so on and so forth, okay? So an example of something that's nearly universal, or probably universal, are rules regarding incest. So here you see we have, what were their names? Cersei and Jaime Lannister, the brother and sister who were involved with each other. Most, if not all cultures, would have some sort of rules or guidelines against that type of relationship. However, for almost every rule that anthropologists think is probably a universal, we almost always find exceptions, okay? So through history in different cultures, there have been examples of royal bloodlines, royal families, where brother and sister or closely related people do have children together to preserve bloodlines, and it's an exception made for members of a royal family. So just when we try to find think we find something special, we find a rule against it. That's just kind of humanity in general for you. So moving on, a generality. It exists in some but not all societies, sometimes as a result of shared history or colonial rule. So an example is the English language amongst some societies, especially those that were colonized or settled or part of the British Empire are likely to speak English, okay? Nuclear families are the norm in many but not all cultures, and they might not even be the most commonly found type of family. Moving on, we have a particularity, and I kind of touched on this a little bit in the previous segment on the barrel model, where I was talking about why I cover different cultures for different topics. For example, when looking at economic systems, I study the Trobriand Islanders because they have a unique series of economic exchanges, basically. So particularity describes something distinctive or unique about a culture, a unique culture trait, pattern, or integration. So here on this slide, you can see I have an image of the Mosuo people. They are matriarchal, and men never leave their mother's homes. So a man's social role is not as a head of household or husband. His role is to be a son or an uncle and remain in his mother's home for life. And we will talk more about them later on in the semester, most likely. But in examining them, we can look at our own cultural practices and realize, kind of unveil our familiar structure by setting them next to the Mosuo's familiar structure. And that comparison can make us aware, as it says in the slide here, aware of underlying values that may not have been apparent. So they kind of lift the veil on our own practices by looking at a different practice or something unique. Okay, a couple more terms and a few more slides left to go here. We want to look at ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism is a tendency to view one's own culture as superior and to use one's own standards and values in judging outsiders. So ethnocentrism is obviously something we try to avoid in anthropology, but we want to be aware of it as well. So if you're having an ethnocentric tendency, that doesn't make you a bad person. We just want to be aware of it and kind of reflect on it as we're studying other cultures. So here you can see a table here, and you can read this on your own of contrasting two different concepts, ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. And I think it's impossible for any one person to be culturally relative all the time and to never be ethnocentric, but these are kind of some guidelines that we tend to follow in anthropology, if we're thinking about it. So, cultural relativism is to know another culture requires full understanding of its members' beliefs and motivations. So cultural relativism is the notion that in order to understand another culture, we need to look at its individual members, beliefs and motivations. We need to understand them. We need to put their society in context. So this brings us back to the contextuality of anthropology. So as we study different cultures in this class, we should evaluate the cultures within their own contexts, not with what we would do in our culture or with the values or motivations of another culture. So we must try to understand the perceptions and motivations of others. That's just a general guideline. If we approach a different concept or an idea with the fact or notion that first we don't like it, if you don't like something or if something makes you angry, it's going to be hard for you to learn about it. So sometimes we have to set aside our own judgment in order to learn more about others. And that's kind of why we're looking at these two concepts here. Okay, this is a summary of our 4-part series on culture. By now, you should understand that culture is a system of dynamic, learned, and shared beliefs, behaviors, and values. That we use the Barrow model in this class to organize different elements of culture within infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure. And there are many subtopics within those levels. And know that we try to avoid ethnocentrism and understand culture from within that culture's perspective within anthropology. Although nobody's perfect, we're going to fail at this sometimes, but that's what we try to do. So I hope you understand a little bit more about culture now, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you for listening.